Welcome to Native American history. Today we step onto the winter ground of Wounded Knee, 1890. What if everything you think you know is missing 7 crucial truths? Stay with me. By the end you'll hear the creek differently. Snow lifts in slow sheets across the flats as the sun climbs. December 29, 1890. Wounded Knee Creek, South Dakota. A circle of lodges ringed by soldiers, and a single question cuts the cold. How does a prayer turn into gunfire before noon? The wind moves through canvas and beadwork and pony manes, and in that breath lives the first stake, the living stake, a camp of Oglala, Lakota, and Mini-Konju. Lakota, who have walked for safety, not for war, who have tied children into cradle boards and led elders by the hand, who have brought songs instead of battle cries, because a circle dance has promised not vengeance but return. The second stake rides under the first, like the river under ice, the stake of land and law, and the heritage that gives a name to every ridge and draw a stake written in broken papers and ration cuts and surveys that slice a nation into fenced rectangles, a stake that does not bleed but can still be killed. They call the movement ghost dance, but the name hides the feeling that carries it. The feeling of a door cracked open to the old world where buffalo feed and kinship lines hold, where grief does not swallow a people whole. News has run ahead of the dancers like wildfire rumors of shirts that bullets cannot pierce, reports of wild frenzy at agencies' telegrams that stampede troops faster than wagons filled with flour. The people in this camp know the difference between frenzy and fasting, between a soldier's inventory and a grandmother's promise whispered to a child at night. They have come under escort seeking shelter near Pine Ridge Agency, a pause point, a breath, a place where uniforms might look like protection and not a closing hand. The distance to this creek is measured in winters. After the Great Sioux Agreement of 1889, the land map breaks and the ration rolls thin, and a hunger you cannot film enters the body like a slow storm. Weeks ago at Standing Rock Agency, the killing of Sitting Bull rips a seam in the world, and fear steps through. Word of that death travels in the same air as the dance, and every campfire retells it in fragments. A cuff, a struggle, a shot, a body on the ground where a voice used to be. The riders who arrive here carry that story in their bones, which means they carry it into every negotiation and every moment of silence with blue coats who say, "Surrender your guns and all will be well." At first light, soldiers take the ridges above the lodges and lower muzzles toward canvas walls. Interpreters stand between two languages and a river of suspicion trying to ferry sense back and forth, while the current pulls hard. A detail is sent to gather rifles, to count knives, to count bows, to count the very means by which a man still names himself after the buffalo have gone. The shape of the ring tightens. Hope begins to breathe faster. Somewhere, a drum begins a soft pulse under the orders and the metal clatter, as if the heart of the camp is reminding itself to keep time. What happens next will be argued in reports and headlines and testimonies, but before the first crack of a shot answers the wind, the stakes have already been set. Either this ring of steel around families becomes an escort toward safety, or it becomes a funnel toward a trench on a hill. Either the language of the people will cross this morning intact, or it will have to be carried forward by those who survive to tell it. The snow brightens, the ridges wait. A hand reaches for a rifle that a man insists is his, and paid for, and in that reach hangs the whole weight of the winter. Now we follow the road that brought everyone to this draw and the names of those who stood on both sides of the circle. The road into this valley is made of 4 moments. In late summer 1890, the ghost dance reaches the northern plains and moves from agency to agency in widening circles carried by kin visits and wagon tracks, and the wish for a world reset to balance. On December 15, Standing Rock turns from rumor to rupture when Sitting Bull is killed in an arrest gone wrong, and fear begins riding ahead of every message. On December 28, soldiers intercept the Mini-Konju Lakota band, led by Spotted Elk near Porcupine Creek, and because the leader is coughing and the people are tired, they accept an escort toward Pine Ridge with the promise of safety. At first light on December 29, the escort becomes an encirclement at Wounded Knee Creek with 4 Hotchkiss guns sighted from the low hills and companies of the 7th Cavalry forming a ring. In the center of this story stands Spotted Elk, known in English as Bigfoot, a leader whose body is fighting pneumonia and whose decisions are shaped by the presence of children and elders in his camp. He is not planning a charge. He is looking for a place to stop without losing more lives. Near him moves American Horse of the Oglala Lakota, a man who has argued for survival through hard winters and seen enough broken promises to measure every new order twice. He carries a voice that will later describe what he saw with the spare force of a witness who understands how words can keep the dead present. Across the ring stands Colonel James W. Forsyth, commanding elements of the 7th Cavalry, an officer under pressure to end what officials in distant offices have labeled an outbreak. His men bring the weight of an earlier war and a regimental memory of Little Bighorn to this white morning. The land arranges the scene as much as rank does. Wounded Knee Creek is a shallow cut in the prairie, a ribbon of frozen water with willow and grass on its banks and soft rolls that make natural firing positions on either side. Wood is scarce, and the people rely on canvas and the thin warmth of shared breath. The wind comes hard across open country, and when the snow lifts, it moves like smoke around the lodges. Nothing on the ground suggests a battlefield built for equal forces. There is no fortification, no prepared trench, only a winter camp stacked with travois bundles and the small domestic gear of a people traveling. One line in the papers undergirds everything. The Great Sioux Agreement of 1889 split the Great Sioux Reservation into smaller agencies, opened millions of acres to settlers, and tied rations and annuities to signatures and compliance, a policy shift that turned hunger into a month-to-month fact and made the ghost dance as much a response to paper as to prophecy. Telegraph keys took over where couriers once rode. At Pine Ridge, the agent Daniel Royer, young and rattled by the sight of dancing, sent alarms that multiplied in Washington and in the Department of the Platte. General Nelson Miles moved troops across a broad fan of prairie posts. By the time Forsyth's companies reached this creek, the language of emergency had hardened into checklists: disarm, count, relocate, report. People here remember terrain in terms of use. The ravine to the north is a path out if the ring loosens. The low-rise south offers a view and now a threat where artillery has been dragged into place. Water is life in warmer seasons. In winter, it becomes a slick seam on the camp's edge. Food is flour, bacon, coffee, and whatever small game can be found along the way. The buffalo are stories in robes, not herds. Horses' wahs are thin and watched closely. Songs warm more than the fires do. For a brief hour on this morning, talk still seems possible. Interpreters move between Forsyth's detail and the Lakota headman. Rifles and knives are stacked in small clusters, slow as dignity allows. Some men hand over old carbines that are more symbol than threat. Others hold to newer rifles paid for in hard trade, the last goods that say a man has standing in a world where hunting is gone. The line between escort and arrest is walked, word by word, gesture by gesture, in a wind that erases footprints as quickly as they are made. The ring tightens by inches. The guns on the hills wait without speaking, and on both sides of the circle, people keep measuring whether this road still leads to shelter or whether it bends towards something else entirely. Now the first small mistakes begin to stack like kindling, and the morning leans toward the moment when sound will replace speech. The first incident is small enough to pass unnoticed if you are not watching the edges. A squad moves through the lodges to gather rifles, and an interpreter tells the men to place weapons in a pile beside a wagon. Some do, some hesitate. A Miniconjou elder turns a carbine over in his hands, touches the stock as though it were a family object, and then sets it down. Another man keeps his Winchester across his knees, perched on a blanket roll, eyes moving between the ring of soldiers and the slope where the guns are emplaced. The soldiers begin patting down blankets and lifting lodge flaps. One trooper pulls a knife from a bundle wrapped for travel and holds it up like a trophy. The gesture is small, but it stings. The air tightens. The second incident arrives with the weather because winter is a participant here. The night has been too cold for sleep, and now the morning wind slides under canvas and lifts it. Coffee is a rumor, not a meal. Children cough and rub their hands together inside shawls. Horses stamp and toss their heads at the smell of Hotchkiss oil and coal smoke. Hunger is a second interpreter translating every order into a question about survival. When a sergeant tells the people to move closer to the center of the ring, for counting some try to comply, and others think of Stampede Creek and Porcupine, and any path that leads away from this white bowl in the land. In a different season, the creek could be crossed, and the willows used as cover. In this season, the snow records movement for a while, and then erases it, giving pursuit an advantage even before pursuit begins. The third incident is a parley that will not hold. A few headmen among them, men who have argued for calm, step forward to confirm what is being demanded. Surrender the guns, all of them, the old and the new, and then move the camp to the agency as directed. Escort will continue. No harm intended. The words are good words in the mouths of the interpreters, but they fall into a space packed with other words carried from Standing Rock and Cheyenne River. Words about warrants and sudden arrests and a leader dead in his own yard. Spotted Elk's breath rattles as he tries to speak. He gestures assent to hand over what the men can spare, but the standard of what can be spared is different for a man who believes his rifle is the last property that says he is not yet broken. Forsyth expects clean compliance because his orders say compliance is the test of peace. The headmen expect a measure of dignity because they believe they have come under escort, not as prisoners. Between those expectations, the distance of a hand's breadth opens. There is a tactical signal now seen and remembered by many. The artillery crews on the rises fix their sights, and one of the guns is angled to rake the camp rather than fire over it. Down below, troopers tighten the ring by a few paces and begin moving people into smaller clusters for counting. The logic is administrative. The feeling is corralling. A few women gather children behind a lodge that gives slight shelter from the north wind and tie shawls tighter across small mouths to warm the air before it is breathed. A boy of perhaps 12 watches a corporal testing the action of a rifle just confiscated and notes how easily the man works the lever. The boy may have seen that same motion in a different setting on a hunt that will not come again. The fourth incident is a search that becomes a scuffle. A detail reaches a young man named Black Coyote. Accounts differ on his age and temper, but they agree on this: the rifle he holds is new and precious. In a world where precious things are few, he says it is his. He says he paid for it. He does not want to hand it over because he believes that without it, he is no longer a man who can protect his family. Hands reach. An interpreter urges calm. A soldier grabs the barrel. The muzzle lifts and dips in a small, frantic dance. In the ring, there is the feeling of a match struck near dry grass. Somewhere close, a medicine singer begins a quiet rhythm, perhaps to steady breath, perhaps to remind the people that prayer does not require surrender of dignity. The tune is not loud enough to be a challenge. It is loud enough to be mistaken. A trooper shouts an order. Another answers. The men on the ridge adjust their stance against the recoil they know is coming, if the worst comes. Within the circle, the elder who set down his carbine earlier puts his hand on the shoulder of a boy and presses him toward a space between lodges where the snowdrift is high enough to hide a small body. The fifth incident is sound. It comes as a crack that does not belong to the wind. No record settles the question of whose trigger made it, but every record agrees what followed felt immediate and immense. Hotchkiss crews do not wait for philosophical clarity about first cause. They answer with steel, and the first shell tears canvas and air together. Horses rear. The ring dissolves into streaks of motion that cross in panic. Some soldiers fire into the lodges because movement inside reads like threat through the smoke and frost. Some Lakota men dive for the stacked rifles to reclaim what they can. Others throw their bodies over the very children they told stories to the night before. Later, in a testimony given to a government interviewer, American Horse described what he witnessed with a restraint that makes the words colder. He said, "Then the Hotchkiss opened on the women and children, and went on to name who fell as he tried to pull the living away from the line of fire. Whether you take his sentence as evidence or elegy depends on what you ask history to do. Here in this valley, it functions as both a record and a lament. As the first minutes pass, the incidents merge into a single event that historians will divide again, counting shots and bodies and orders in separate columns. But in the camp, it is one thing: a collapse of negotiation into noise. The parley fails not because words were wrong, but because the conditions in which they were spoken were already fatally arranged. Resource and weather stress have taken the edge off judgment. Tactical positions have made patience unnecessary. Every human system on the field begins to do what it was built to do under pressure. The ring becomes a funnel. The rises become scythes. The ravine becomes a road that does not promise safety, only movement. Smoke and snow blur the air so that faces become silhouettes and names become the names someone will have to speak later to keep them from disappearing. On the slope, the artillery teams work their drills with the serene urgency of men solving a problem fast. In the camp, mothers pull children through gaps that close as quickly as they open. A trooper who a moment ago was searching blankets now fires at a shadow because his training says shadows that move within a ring are threats. An interpreter calls out a word that means stop in one language and nothing in the other. Somewhere, Spotted Elk coughs and slides from his pony to the ground. All of this takes very few minutes and yet contains years inside it. The decisions made at agencies, the paper that sliced land into parcels, the hunger that converted a rifle into a certificate of personhood, the memory of a fight on a different river. 14 summers earlier, the hope carried in a dance that promised return, all pour into this draw and collide. The sound begins to thin only because bodies fall and because ammunition is not infinite. When it thins, what remains is wind and crying and the distant metal chatter of a gun being cleared for another burst. The ridge crews signal to each other without words. Below, a man lifts a lodge flap and looks into a space where there is no one left alive to shelter. The morning is not yet half spent. The next turn is not an argument. It is a pivot in the shape of the ground and the positions of the guns, and once it begins, it will be very hard to stop. The pivot begins not with a plan, but with the way ground shapes breath. The ring collapses inward as if the prairie itself has decided to narrow. Smoke and blown snow roll together so that distance becomes a rumor, and the ridge guns can fire by memory of arcs they sighted at dawn. In that instant, belief meets geometry. The ghost dance is not a command to charge. It is a way of remembering that a people's life exists beyond the present wound. But in the white roar of this morning, belief is forced to answer physics. A round fired on a depressed trajectory will saw through canvas and flesh, whether the heart inside the lodge is singing or silent. The old men know this. The mothers know this. All that remains is choosing where to put the body, so that one more child may still have a voice. Some reach for the ravine north of the lodges, because the draw lies just below the gun arcs and offers a brief shadow from the ridge fire. The ground there is slick with a sheet of ice beneath a dusting of snow, and the willows are thin, their winter branches too brittle to stop anything but wind. In a summer fight, the creek bed would be a desirable corridor, a wove of cover for people who can move fast and low. In winter, it is a ribbon that records tracks for pursuers. Still, it gives shape to motion where the open flat offers only exposure. Families angle toward it in splinters. Each small group its own command, its own plan, parents and uncles and aunts acting as flankers and skirmishers around the children, without ever using those words. Others try for the low rise to the southeast where the ridge dips and a shallow fold might mask a crawl. That rise is also the place where one Hotchkiss has a partial blind spot, a wedge of ground the crew cannot rake without traversing past its own men. The Lakota who choose that path are reading the ridge like hunters read elk beds, looking for the one line a predator's eye will skip. Men who grew up stalking antelope across the Platte still carry those angles in their bones even if the herds are gone. They move as if reenacting a memory that might yet save them. The cost of being wrong is only measured once. Inside the ring, the geometry is tighter and uglier. Troopers who have entered lodges to search are now trapped in swirls of canvas and smoke and terrified bodies. A soldier who pulls at a lodge pole to clear a line of sight brings the roof down on himself and opens the interior to the ridge, where a crew eager to see their work suddenly recognizes friendly caps and holds fire for a beat that feels like a year. A Lakota man reaching for the stacked rifles finds one with a frozen lever and works it with mittened hands that are already numb. His first shot is wild, his second better, and by the third, he is out of cartridges because the weapon he has reclaimed is stamped with a supply chain's indifference. In the corner of that same space, a woman ties her child to a traveled board with strips from her own dress because straps are where the blanket roll is and there is no time to sort through baggage. Belief does not leave. It changes jobs. The shirt that once held a promise becomes a wrap to deaden a sound, a binding for a wound, a flag to wave at a trooper who might remember that he too is a human being. The song shifts from petition to cadence, a breath count to steady feet on ice. A medicine bundle is thrust into a cousin's hands with a nod that says, "Carry this to the next camp if I do not." There is a law here that is older than the laws written in the agencies, the law that says a people's name must cross the worst morning and arrive in the next season intact. The law of survivance is not poetry on the prairie, it is logistics. Who holds the infant? Who knows the route to the next water? Who can still speak to an agent in English without letting English replace their name? On the ridge, the crews settle into their drill. One man feeds shells, another sights, a third calls corrections. Their formation is textbook, 2 pieces raking the camp from the north, rise 2 covering escape lines to the south and west. The infantry squads hold a staggered cordon with intervals that can be closed on command, and the cavalrymen keep their mounts on a reverse slope ready to swing if a breakout congeals into a column. The timing is calculated to prevent concentration bursts of canister, to scatter volleys, to fix, then advance in wedges, to collect and separate. In a town square, this would be crowd control. In a winter camp, it becomes slaughter by the properties of space. Officers ride between posts as if herding their own men, reminding them not to bunch and not to shoot through partners. Reminders that always arrive a breath late, because fear outruns instruction. On the plain below the Lakota, build a formation that has nothing to do with parade ground diagrams and everything to do with family. A man and 2 women take positions on either side of a small knot of children. Another pair moves ahead a few paces, scouts for the next fold in the ground, then lifts an arm to signal. The signal is not a military semaphore. It is kin agreeing with kin which way to turn. Those who still carry weapons fire deliberately not to win a battle that cannot be won, but to make a hole in the ring wide enough for a handful more to slip through. Protection looks like attack from the ridge. It is not attack. It is choosing whose name crosses this day. Ethics and community weight settle like another layer of snow. There are choices so heavy that the body must grow a new muscle to lift them, and the morning is full of such choices. A boy tries to pull his grandfather to his feet, and is commanded to leave him because the grandfather knows he cannot move fast enough and does the arithmetic of love without complaint. A woman gives her shawl to someone else's child because the child is closer to the gap and her own is already wrapped. A man steps into the path of a trooper who is swinging his rifle like a club and trains the blow onto himself because behind him a girl is shaking so hard she cannot run. The ethics here are not written in books. They are written in where bodies are placed in relation to danger. The cost is immediate and unredeemable. Shock peaks in strange ways. It peaks when a horse wounded and crazy with noise turns a circle and stands as a movable wall between a cluster of people and a burst of fire, then crashes down exactly in the right place to make a momentary berm. It peaks when a trooper recognizes an earring in the ear of a man he is grappling and freezes because the same pattern is dangling from his own sister's lobe in a photograph back home. It peaks when a boy no older than 12 lifts a fallen soldier's canteen to his own mouth, and the soldier not dead reaches for the same canteen, and for a second their hands hold the same tin. The ridge cannot see any of this. The ridge sees only movement in a field of targets. There is also the cold arithmetic of pursuit already forming at the edges. If a group reaches the ravine and runs downstream, the cordon will collapse and sweep along the banks in a combing motion. If a group breaks west over the rise, the cavalry will swing around to cut them off in the open. The best corridor is the worst straight back through the thinnest part of the ring that is under the heaviest fire, because the men in that segment are now crouched and blinking in smoke, and in chaos, men lose depth perception before they lose trigger discipline. Some choose that corridor because their ears, not their eyes, tell them it is where noise is most disorganized. They run toward the ugliest sound because it is the sound of a formation not yet recovered. Time at the pivot compresses further. Minutes become counts of how many breaths it takes to cover 10 paces in snow. The ridge crews, confident in their placement, begin to conserve ammunition for another hour because officers are thinking ahead to what comes after the count, and the report, and the justification. Below, no one is saving anything. The camp is in a state beyond economy. All stores are now potential shields or sleds or splints. The line between sacred and useful dissolves in the clarity of survival. A medicine pipe is used as a tent pole. A sacred song is used to set a pace. The sacredness is not diminished, it is activated. The presence of spotted elk near the center is like a broken star, both light and gravity. Men try to keep him in sight and then fail because sight is a luxury you hold after sound stops battering the bones. He coughs, which is a detail too human to be strategic, and yet it becomes strategic because it slows the group around him and creates eddies in movement that the ring can exploit. A few step forward to lift him. Others step sideways to draw fire away. Leadership here is not command, it is placement. The cost of holding a leader upright is paid by those who make themselves more visible. Then there is the moment when words leave for good. Interpreters who began the morning believing speech could bridge the gap. Stand mouths open, moving without sound because the mouth has become an organ for breathing only. Orders shrink to gestures. A hand slashes left. A chin lifts. A palm flattens down. In that economy of signs, a single mistaken reading can bleed a cluster of people into the open at exactly the wrong second. And that mistake happens because everyone is tired and cold and full of adrenaline. It is no one's fault and everyone's cost. The tactical reason for the pivot is clear. A disarmament detail already inside a ring supported by artillery loses control of a single weapon, and a single shot removes the possibility of order. The logistical reasons are equally clear. Winter has degraded judgment and mobility. Rations have stripped strength. The ground favors the party that arrived early and placed its guns. The reason that matters to those who live is simpler. The circle that began as a prayer cannot hold against iron sight lines. So, the circle changes shape. It stretches into lines of flight and lines of covering fire, into lines of bodies placed to intercept harm, into lines of memory that must later carry the names forward. When the worst of the firing ebbs, counting begins, a dry human habit that asserts itself even in a white field full of noise. Men count who is within arm's reach and who is not. They count how many cartridges are left in a belt. They count breaths to slow a heart running too fast. When officers on the ridge count, they do so for paper that will travel. When women in the ravine count, they are making sure the story will have a teller. The cost is written down in 2 scripts at once. By midday, the confrontation no longer looks like a battle to anyone close enough to smell the smoke. It looks like a clearing action around a winter camp. It looks like families trying to move through a field of lines drawn by people who did not sleep in that camp last night. It looks like a people deciding in real time which pieces of their inheritance must cross this day in human lungs and which may be entrusted to the earth. The ridge still holds its geometry. The camp still holds its kin. Between them runs a creek that no longer makes sound because the cold has sealed it. The next turn will be counted in bodies and in words written later on government paper and in ledgers kept at home. The morning has spent its mercy. Afternoon will ask a different sort of endurance. The first outcome is pursuit, because even when the sound thins, the shape of danger does not. Men on the ridge sweep down along the ravine, boots skating on ice, calling to each other over the wind. What they find are trails of small feet and the signs of bodies dragged into the willows, where the branches fork like ribs. Shots still crack in singles. A man who has 3 cartridges left fires 2 wide and saves one because his cousin has fallen and will not rise, and someone must hold a space open for the living to pass. Farther out on the flats, cavalrymen remount and angle across the snow to cut off lines west and south. Horses shy at patches of red that steam briefly before the cold takes the last of the heat away. Pursuit is also administrative. Details move through the broken lodges and count. They count weapons recovered, count bodies, count the wounded who might be moved, and the wounded who might not survive a move. What cannot be counted is set aside beneath blankets because paper must be filled, and wagons do not wait for grief. In the agency buildings, a room becomes an infirmary. The smell of carbolic and smoke and winter coats pressed too close together chases sleep from the eyes of people who have not slept anyway. A girl with a torn shoulder watches the doorway, as if each footfall might be the person she is waiting for. A nurse cuts away a spirit shirt to get at a wound, and sets the cloth aside with a care that an officer misreads as superstition. It is not superstition, it is respect for the hands that made it. Out beyond the first ring of hills, pursuit enters its second day. A skirmish flares near the mission on the white clay, and burns itself out against the same winter that erased tracks east of the creek. Those who fled the first storm of fire break into small units that can live on what the country still offers this late in the season. A grandmother starts a song not as ceremony, but as a way of making steps. In each cluster where a working law takes hold, those who can still carry lift, those who can still aim cover, those who can still speak to officials in English, rehearse the words they will need when they are found. Survival becomes both movement and translation. The second outcome is the ledger, and in ledger time most things happen quickly or not at all. Officers write reports that rescue order from smoke. A general who was not on the ground writes a long letter that describes what he believes happened and what he believes should have happened. He sends it to the department and to the papers. The word battle appears. So does the word outbreak. The word massacre appears too, but mostly in the mouths of those who stood among the lodges when the first Hotchkiss barked. A telegram travels faster than a wagon. The wagons carry the wounded and the dead. The telegrams carry narrative. Numbers are marshaled to hold a story in place. Some are precise to the digit where they are easy to count, such as how many shells were issued to each gun crew. Some are approximate where the field will not hold still. 2 columns face each other. In one column stand Lakota dead and wounded, a count that slides between at least 150 and well over 250, depending on who is asked and when the asking is done. In the facing column stand soldiers dead and wounded fixed at a lower figure with emphasis on men struck by friendly fire when the line of sight disappeared into canvas and snow. Between those columns stands an anchor statistic that will not move. The United States issued 20 medals of honor for actions at Wounded Knee, a number that would later become its own battlefield in the realm of memory and law. The third outcome is legal only in the sense that paper must answer for bodies. An inquiry is opened. Testimony is taken in rooms where heat hisses through pipes and the winter is kept on the other side of the glass. The inquiry asks whether officers exercised proper control, whether disarmament was conducted according to instruction, whether the fires from the ridge were justified by the threat below. The inquiry does not ask questions that paper cannot hold, such as whether a camp filled with families should ever have been encircled under guns. Colonel Forsyth is relieved of command and then restored. No court finds a figure to bear formal blame. Language does the rest. In the archives, the event becomes an engagement. In the homes of the people, it becomes a wound that teaches. Law reaches farther back than the morning on the creek. The Dawes Act has already begun to atomize land into allotments and declare any remainder surplus. The Great Sioux Agreement has already sliced the map and replaced a nation with a system of agencies and agents. The day at Wounded Knee hardens this paperwork into something like fate for a while. Where a treaty once lived as a promise, policy now lives as enforcement. Where enforcement arrives with rifles, policy becomes indistinguishable from force. The living know this at a level that will never make it into an index. They know it because the land that holds their dead is now ringed by fences whose posts are numbered on plats that will be filed in distant drawers. The fourth outcome is the cultural and cannot be gathered into a wagon. The ghost dance does not vanish, but it goes underground. Songs are sung in rooms where windows are covered in place, where footsteps are soft and conversations pause when tires swing on agency roads. Winter count keepers add a new pictograph for this year and make sure children can recognize it when they are older. A grandmother will later stitch a design that looks like a falling snow into the edge of a dress and tell her granddaughter that it means, "Keep moving" when the sky turns white. Names are given that recall this season a way of weaving history into the daily speech of a people who refuse to let paper be the only archive. Schools make their own weather. In the years that follow, agency and church schools pull children into rooms where English is a river that pushes hard at the banks of the old language. Some children learn to walk in two currents, carrying words home in the evening and guarding them like tinder. Some are shamed out of speaking in the voices they first heard in the lodge. The harm accumulates quietly. Then slowly a countercurrent rises. A young person who survived the winter of 1890 becomes an elder who uses English deliberately when speaking to officials and Lakota when blessing a child. A teacher in a later decade begins a class with an old greeting and sees a half-dozen faces lift, as if a door had opened in the wall. There is also a geography of loss. The trench on the hill holds bodies recovered, these after the guns fell quiet. Some lay where they fell until the weather allowed work. Families who can reach the site later come with bundles and word-set offerings that look to an outsider like small household goods, and to an insider like the exact things needed to continue a relationship with the dead. A photographer's plates of the burial and the broken lodges leave the valley and travel to cities where they will be captioned and interpreted through frames that do not admit the voices of those in the pictures. The images become famous and indistinct at the same time. In the homes that remember, the famous image is the least complete. Not every consequence is visible. A man who lived through the circle of guns will look down at his hands a decade later and still see snow on the knuckles. A woman who wrapped her child that morning will unfold cloth in a different winter and feel how the body remembers which corners to pull first. A soldier who loaded shells on the ridge will hear metal against metal when he draws water from a pail and not know why his breath has shortened until he sets the bucket down and waits. The event has its own life after the event, moving through nerves and families and talk in a way that resists courts and headlines. There are attempts at repair even in the first weeks. Some officers ride to the agencies where survivors gather and offer words that sound like apology, without the force of apology behind them. Ministers pray in English over people who would rather hear someone say the names of the dead in the language that raised them. A doctor spends long hours washing wounds with water so cold it burns and wrapping them with hands that crack and bleed through the gloves. He sleeps in a chair because no one can lie down without dreaming of the sound that opened the morning. In the wider country, the aftermath becomes politics. Papers in far cities print columns that defend the action as necessary to end an imagined uprising, and other papers print columns that ask how a nation understands itself if it grants honors for killing women and children. The word reconcile appears early and often applied like a poultice to a wound that requires surgery. A senator files a resolution that never reaches a vote. A group of citizens writes a petition that never reaches a floor. On reservations, people continue to bury their dead and memorize their names and teach their children how to hold both grief and pride without letting either consume the other. What land means after this morning shifts in small increments. A family decides never to camp near that draw again. Another family decides to visit it every year as a way of anchoring the calendar. Hunters mark a bend where wind always seems to carry the past into the present and avoid it when they can. A few years on a line is drawn on a map designating a memorial, and the presence of the state is made official in a place where the presence of ancestors never needed a sign. Road crews grade the approach. Visitors arrive. Some speak softly. Some do not know how to enter a place where the air still holds 100 names, and so they say nothing and leave quickly. The land adds each footfall to its count. The anchor statistic remains heavy as lead on the page. 20 medals of honor for actions at Wounded Knee. Each medal has a citation. Each citation has a sentence shaped like duty. In the homes where the story is told at night, the count is different. How many children lived? How many words survived? How many songs still rise when a drum starts? Paper will be argued against paper in years to come. In the meantime, the people practice what keeps them a people names food care story. By the close of this season, the official processes have done what they will do for now, and the living have done what they must to see the next thaw. The arguments in distant rooms will continue. The rifles will be cleaned and stored. The ridge will go back to being a ridge. And still in quiet houses, a sentence will be spoken at the door before sleep that amounts to a promise made to the unborn. You will know what happened here, and you will know who you are in spite of it. The next step in the story does not belong to the field or the ridge guns. It belongs to paper, and to the men who control it, and to the small resistances that can be written even inside a document. In the months that followed, the law arranged itself around the winter field, in the only way it knew how, by asking narrow questions and answering them even more narrowly. A board of inquiry convened in 1891 to determine whether officers had acted within orders. Witnesses described the scramble for rifles, the single shot that nobody could reliably own, and the Hotchkiss fire that followed. Colonel Forsyth was relieved and then restored. The file closed without a criminal reckoning, and with it, the state chose the vocabulary that would stand for a generation. Official papers called the event a fight against an outbreak. The people who buried their family called it a massacre. That difference did not disappear into the archive. It settled over the land like a second weather. Policy did not loosen after the snow melted. The Dawes Act's logic of allotment continued to break communal land into parcels, and the Great Sioux Agreement's map held, where a treaty had promised a nation statute delivered fenced rectangles governed by agencies. Land that had carried the dead now had survey numbers. The creek that remembered names now had coordinates. In 1900, the files were tidy enough that school superintendents spoke of progress in annual reports, while winter count keepers added a new mark for the year when a circle of lodges met artillery. The legal end state, if you squinted, looked like order. Up close, it looked like grief made administrative. Two debates persisted inside and beyond those files. One was arithmetic. How many Lakota died at Wounded Knee? The counts ranged because bodies lay under storm and drift, because some of the wounded slipped away and died elsewhere, because soldiers and officials had reasons to minimize or misclassify, because survivors remembered in the units that mattered to families rather than to ledgers. Historians have carefully bracketed the number hundreds, not dozens, and agree most of the dead were women and children. The second debate is not about quantity, but about language. Was this battle or massacre? Newspapers in 1890 and 1891 printed both words. Over the 20th century, scholarship leaned, then settled on massacre, while official decorations told a different story. Those decorations form the anchor the record cannot lift. 20 medals of honor were issued to soldiers for actions at Wounded Knee. Citations described duty under fire and rescuing wounded comrades in the chaos. And in later years, veterans groups and lawmakers defended the awards as a recognition of individual courage rather than a judgment on the day. Families and advocates read the same list and saw something else: the highest military honor affixed to the killing ground of a camp. Attempts to rescind the medals surfaced notably in late 20th and early 21st century efforts and gathered signatures and hearings, but not the votes required to turn a petition into law. The medals remain not as a conclusion, but as a pressure point that keeps the argument present. Time added layers without closing the first. In 1965, the federal government designated Wounded Knee a National Historic Landmark, recognizing the site's national significance while leaving control of its meaning contested. Markers appeared, roads improved, visitors came. Some of them arrived because of another Wounded Knee, the 71-day occupation in 1973, when activists used the name of the place to demand changes as old as the first treaties and as current as the week's headlines. For the people whose family names were spoken into the wind in 1890, the second Wounded Knee and the first share a root. Both are arguments over who gets to define a nation's future and how that argument is heard. The legal documents grew more nuanced as the century turned. Official apologies were spoken by church bodies and state officials in some years. Congressional resolutions marked remembrance in others. None of these could rewrite the ledger of the first winter, but they did shift the public vocabulary. School curricula changed in some districts to use the word massacre, where older texts had not. Museum labels moved away from euphemism. More survivor narratives entered classrooms and exhibitions. The law moved slowly, the public language more quickly, and the land did what land always does, which is to keep what happened without comment. Two specific points remain to be clarified for anyone listening across the years. The first is the ghost dance itself. Its shirts were not armor and were never treated as such by people who lived with rifles and weather. They were symbols in a season of prayer, and believers went to the creek under escort to find safety, not to attack. The second is the first shot. Testimony conflicts in ways that cannot be harmonized, but the conflict does not alter the geometry that made the day lethal. Artillery set on the heights above a winter camp guarantees that a single crack can turn into a sweep of fire across families. To choose the word battle for that geometry is to rename the ground. Bridging forward, the documents change tone. By the late 20th and early 21st centuries, continuance becomes visible in places where policy once erased it. Language programs take root on Pine Ridge and beyond classrooms, where a morning begins with a greeting. An elder would recognize, where children are taught that a word is not only a sound, but a way of walking. Memorial runs link communities across winter miles, carrying staffs and names and prayers for the living as much as for the dead. Ceremonies at the hill call out the year and the families and ask the earth to listen, as if the earth had ever stopped. Law has not finished with the place. Bills arise from time to time that would adjust recognition, return artifacts fund preservation, or address the standing of the metals. Some advance and stall, some are reintroduced with new language and old intent. Tribal governments assert what they have always held, that sovereignty is not the gift of a statute, but the name of a relationship older than the statute book. Courts interpret, agencies administer, the people continue. The end state, if such a phrase can be used, is a braid rather than a period, a landmark on the map, a chapter in the law, and a living community that insists on being the subject of its own sentence. By the time you stand at the fence and look toward the trench, you have already crossed a century of paper, a century of argument, and a century of songs. You can feel all three if you allow the wind to do its work. The legal record will take you to 1891 and the decision to restore a command. The political record will take you to the landmark designation and the debates over honor. The cultural record will take you into kitchens and classrooms, where the language returns and a child writes a name on a page without being told to erase it. None of these cancels the others. Together they form a path that leads out of the field and back into the present. What remains to be told belongs to those who live here now. The bridge is laid from inquiry to landmark, from medal lists to classroom roll calls, from the winter count to the road sign that bears the name of the creek. Ahead is the part of the story that does not take place in files at all, the part measured in people rather than policy, and songs rather than citations. The field is quiet. The next voices belong to those who kept the language alive long enough to be heard again. Today, the road into the valley carries more than visitors. It carries a people who refuse to end in the snow. Across Pine Ridge and the sister nations on the northern plains live tens of thousands of Lakota families who count their place not only by census figures, but by kinship lines and winter counts by the names spoken at wakes and the laughter that escapes kitchen doors on days when the wind eases. The reservation map looks different from the one in 1890, but the measure that matters is breath classrooms full of children learning the language, their great-grandparents hid in the margins of slate grandmothers, who keep a choreography of care that outlasted policy veterans and runners and singers who carry staffs between communities each winter, so that memory keeps its shape. Language moved quietly for a long time, and then, as if remembering its own momentum, began to speak aloud again. You can hear it at Oglala Lakota College when a student greets an elder with a phrase his grandfather taught him in a truck cab, at immersion classrooms where children answer roll in Lakota and correct each other gently, at community nights where fluent speakers sit in a circle and turn English questions back across the fire in the language that holds their jokes and prayers. Books and apps and radio slots help, but the heart of it is human. A teacher's voice soft in the morning, a child bringing new words home, a parent deciding that homework includes a greeting for an ancestor. When the drum starts at a powwow, the language rides the beat, and the beat writes a circle in the air that no file can erase. The calendar has its bright marks. Each December, the Bigfoot Memorial Riders set out into the cold, retracing the path toward Pine Ridge so that the miles themselves become a lesson. The staff passes from hand to hand. The elders watch hips relax into the saddle rhythm. The young learn how winter clarifies a purpose. At the hill above the creek, gatherings keep the names close, songs rise. Tobacco is offered. Stories are told with the restraint that honors the dead without borrowing their voices. School buses sometimes pull up, and children step down, carefully, eyes widening when the wind lifts and the teacher says, "This is the place." There are graduations and basketball games, quilt giveaways, and naming ceremonies, benefits for families in need, runs that tie communities together. It is a long list, because continuance does not live in one event, but in a braid of many ordinary stubborn acts. Law did not stop at the fence line. It continued to move, sometimes with harm, sometimes with repair. A recent Supreme Court decision upheld the Indian Child Welfare Act, confirming in this generation that the bond between children and nations is not a relic but a living principle. In Congress, efforts surface and return to examine the medals of honor associated with the 1890 killings. Some years the bills gather hearings, some years only signatures, all years they keep the pressure of history present. Repatriations proceed slowly through museums and agencies. Consultations reshape how collections are described and how remains and belongings return to families. None of this replaces a life. All of it acknowledges that relationship, not possession, is the only sound way forward. If you stand by the roadside marker on a clear day, the shock from that first morning in our story, the question of how a prayer became gunfire before noon, echoes differently now. It does not vanish, it changes pitch. The The wind still crosses the draw with the same indifference it had in 1890. But below the wind, you can hear other sounds, a language class reciting the week's lesson, a memorial run tightening its formation as the grade steepens, a grandmother teasing a child in Lakota and the child answering in the same tongue, a veteran's honor song swelling and settling, the pause before a name is spoken, and the low chorus of assent after it. The echo resolves not by offering an answer to the original question, but by placing it where it belongs in a history that includes both harm and endurance sorrow and the choice to continue. Population snapshots reduce lives to digits. The people here refuse that shrinking. Instead, they take stock in other measures: how many students enrolled in language this term, how many horses and riders made the December miles, how many elders were visited this week, how many quilts stitched and lifted in blessing, how many young artists filmed their first interview with a survivor, how many times a day someone says the creek's name as if the word itself were a door. These are not statistics you can fix to a tin ribbon. They are the arithmetic of survivance. Evenings come early in winter, and the prairie keeps its habit of long light in summer. In both seasons, the hill remains a place to speak softly. The trench is there, and so are the signs, but what you carry away is a pattern, the way memory chooses verbs that face forward, the way a nation insists on being more than what was done to it. The field holds what happened. The people hold what must happen next. Study follows remembrance the way footsteps follow a path cut by riders ahead. It is enough to start with two maps, the official one and the one drawn by breath, and to keep walking until they overlap. 7 facts reframed a winter morning and a people's future. What would you tell a student seeing Wounded Knee for the first time? And what sources should we bring to the screen? Subscribe, and thank you for watching.